We've got things like the minimum wage going up by government fiat. And I think everyone's got into a psychology where they're expecting prices to go up, they're expecting wages to follow. One of the things that happens is that when you have zero rates, I think is that the whole microstructure of the economy gets out of line. Unprofitable companies don't disappear. Inflation and investment doesn't move to where it's most profitable and most successful, and the whole thing gets messed up. And I reckon we've done enough reforms to kind of more or less compensate for that, and that's why you don't really see any change to the growth pattern through Brexit.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price. Today I'm delighted to be joined by our Director General, Lord Frost, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Lots, as usual, on the agenda today, not least the state of the economy, our favourite topic, and the latest on the Brexit reset. But before we dive into it, make sure that you comment, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We do read all the comments, and we do really appreciate the feedback, so thank you for that in advance. And also, if you want to get all of our content, our publications, our podcasts, our blogs, our events straight to your inbox, then subscribe to us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Now, that's the admin out of the way. This week's been a blockbuster week in news. We're going to ignore the main story of the day, given that's lots to do with things that we're not particularly interested in here at the IEA. But there was lots of economic news as well, not least the Bank of England's latest rates decision. They have decided to hold interest rates at 3.75%, which was generally what was expected, although the vote was a little bit closer than we thought. Our own Shadow Monetary Policy Committee voted for a small cut in 25 percentage points, 0.25 percentage points, I should say. David, what's your view on what the Bank of England have done with interest rates and the general debate around it?
Yeah, I find it a fascinating debate, actually, at the moment, because all the debate seems to be about how quickly we can bring rates down. And I don't want to impugn the competence of our own Shadow Monetary Committee, Policy Committee, which, as you said, wants to bring them down. But it's not obvious to me that inflation is really under control. It's not obvious that even more the psychology of inflation has really been broken in the economy. And it seems as if everybody is sort of desperate to get rates down again and resume the near zero rates that we've had in recent years.
What exactly do you mean by
What
exactly do you mean by the psychology of inflation?
That everybody has got used to. We had a pulse of inflation, if you like, it's for debate, but it passed through the economy at very high levels. People are still day to day believe they're experiencing high cost increases in some of the basics, and probably they are, I think, slightly higher than CPI. People are not necessarily thinking that wage increases are going to come down. We've got things like the minimum wage going up by government fiat. And I think everyone's got into a psychology where they're expecting prices to go up, they're expecting wages to follow, not like in the catastrophic period of the 70s, but when you're trying to get inflation down to around 2%, those expectations seem to me to be a bit out of line at the moment.
So were you relatively pleased with the Bank of England's decision to sort of hold at the current rate then?
Yeah, I think it's the right thing. I mean, actually, I'm not sure they were right to cut last time, to be honest, while this situation persists.
Mm-hmm. Kristian, what was your view?
Well, I won't pretend to be an expert on monetary policy. I simply don't know enough about it to say I'm on the side of the Monetary Policy Committee or on the side of our own Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. But it is generally, yes, the textbook approach would really be to say you have to get inflation expectations down. And maybe the expectations, they could even be more important than the headline figures. And, even on the headline figures, the Bank of England clearly hasn't met its inflation target yet. And as long as expectations are still high, I can see why they're doing it, why they are not especially relaxed about it and in a hurry to get rates down. And it is also worth pointing out that current interest rates may seem high compared to this long period that we've had since 2008 of near zero rates, but by historic standards. So in the 1990s or so, or before the financial crisis, nobody would have said these are unusual rates. So by historic standards, we are still. It's the post-2008 situation which has been the anomaly. And we shouldn't say just because interest rates are now higher than they were 5 years ago or so that this is somehow a deviation from the new norm. We should ask, how did we get into this place in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think the new norm of the last kind of 15 years or so, where interest rates have been down towards zero, and we've had massive Q&E negative rates in some places across the world. This is, it seems like it was the policymakers' response every time there was some sort of crisis, slowdown, whatever. They pushed interest rates down each time, final time to this below zero figure, and everybody's got used to it. And of course, interest rates are not just a number. They have important effects in the real economy beyond inflation control. And one of the things that happens is that when you have zero rates, I think is that the whole microstructure of the economy gets out of line. Unprofitable companies don't disappear. Inflation and investment doesn't move to where it's most profitable and most successful, and the whole thing gets messed up. And I think we've had quite a dose of that in Britain and in Europe over the last decade or more, and that's why the economy is persistently failing to grow and recover. The productive structure has gotten messed up, and only by squeezing it out of the system are we going to see it recover.
And on that note, at the same time, the Bank of England have also nudged down their GDP forecast for this year from 1.2%, not particularly high anyway, to just 0.9%. Which would be slower than last year's estimate at 1.4%, which is also 1.4% as the number that the OBR used forecast, which was what the sums were added on, were done with at the budget last year. So things aren't looking good in the economy. The problem isn't solved on the growth fund by any means. I mean, I think we'd be a bit more celebratory right now if it was. What effects do you think what's the sort of relationship with the interest rates decision and those extremely pessimistic forecasts for growth?
Well, it's a very complicated question, I think. I mean, obviously they're hoping, or at least part of, one section of the policymakers is hoping that this will give growth a bit of boost, and, the future cut when it comes will help. And that's how this is sold, really, in the public domain now. I'm not really convinced, I must say, for the reason I was just giving, that I think the problem is a supply side one now, and these minor changes in interest rates are not really going to make much difference.
And I guess that's sort of the tone of all of this when we're talking about the growth forecast, Kristian, is that we're looking between 1.4 is the highest prediction. And another think tank this week did predict 1.4% growth for the year, so slightly different view to the Bank of England there. But we're talking about 1.4 versus 0.9. These are
pathetic figures. Yes, it's all around 1%. We should be talking 2, 3, 4, 5%. Yes, of course. Well, I've had a look at the NISA forecast, the National Institute for Social and Economic Research, and they are predicting a slowdown in global growth rates because of a delayed Trump tariff effect. Mm-hmm. And I'd say this shows two things, really. One of them is, anything that shows up in global growth figures is by definition really big, right? Because governments around the world make thousands of economic policy decisions every year, and the vast majority of those will never be visible anywhere in global growth figures. So anything that is even modelable in those terms is massive, and shows it's a really bad situation if the whims of one man have an impact on global growth figures. Mm-hmm. And that's bad enough, but nonetheless, it's not of a magnitude where you could say, well, this is the reason why our economy is stagnant, right? It's not big enough for that. So they're talking about, I think in one year it's a tenth of a percentage point, and another year a fifth or so. Again, we're talking about global growth figures. That's big in that context, but it's not that our policymakers could say, oh, well, this isn't our fault. Global headwinds are unfavorable for us, and therefore nothing we can do about that.
They will try to say that at every single turn, though,
yes.
won't they? I mean, this brings us to the question that we keep coming back to on this podcast: that is the government really does the government really grasp the scale of this problem, and are they acting appropriately? And I think we would all agree no. But is there any hope that they will? Do we think that something will happen this year, David, either politically or in their mindsets that will change their approach to growth to make them bolder and more ambitious?
Not really. I mean, the NISA figures are quite interesting because, I mean, they're only one kind of organisation and their track record is as bad as everybody else's, I think it's fair to say. But they're predicting that the so-called headroom is in fiscal terms is already used up. And I mean, who knows really about that? But perhaps there has been some movement anyway. And we're beginning to see the next phase, if so, of the doom loop that the government is on, that higher taxes reduce the growth rate and therefore make it more difficult to raise the money and accentuate your fiscal problems. And perhaps we're seeing that play out. And I don't know that the government really has I don't know that they really understand where growth comes from, at least in the current state of the economy. I don't know that they really get that it comes from blockages on the supply side, the incentive effects of taxation, regulation, the messy public sector, high energy costs. I don't know whether they really accept that or not. And they just don't seem to have, I'm not sure they accept that, but I don't know where else they expect it to come from. It's like growth is this sort of magic substance that just kind of appears somehow when the heavens bless your conduct of the economy and the country. And so I struggle to say I think anything will change because I just don't know that they know what to do to change the situation.
Well, and if you were to speak to them, we'll get onto this topic and later on in this discussion. But obviously, they think that their Brexit reset is going to solve a lot of those problems, and that will go far away. But also, they we say this all the time as well. But they make lots of good noises about the supply side stuff on the planning side, but then just don't act quick enough. But just to go back to the fiscal headroom point, I think it's depressing, isn't it, that we just seem to be in a state of sort of permanent fiscal firefighting in which the headroom shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and we have months and months and months of speculation about how they're going to close that gap. They do a tax rising budget to close that gap, and then a month and a half later, 2 months later, we're back to the headroom's gone again because the growth figures have gone from 1.4 to 1.2 or whatever it is. Kristian, what do you think they need to do to sort of to get out of that fiscal firefighting doom?
Well, you've said it already. They need to just get on with their YIMBYism reform. That's something which they themselves have announced and want to do. So here, this isn't us projecting an ideology into the government or expecting them to do things that are alien to them, but this is really things that they have already said. It's stated policy. They just need to actually do it for once. And I haven't fully given up hope on that yet. These are things which are already announced, and there may be an element of self-commitment, but it's the sort of thing which is not yet included in any forecast because it isn't sufficiently specific yet. It can't be modeled because it's not yet at a stage where you can say, okay, this is the policy, this is going to be the impact. But relatively simple, basic things like building around the commuter stations in the big cities and around them. And in that way, it's not just the construction activity itself, but also that you get greater agglomeration benefits because you grow the urban centers, the cities where most growth nowadays happens, most value generation. And these are relatively simple things where we have low-hanging fruits. Similarly, on the transport side, connecting some of the medium-sized, smaller cities, make them effectively one economy, things like that. And where you don't even need to spend more. It's not that infrastructure spending is particularly low. It's just that we get less mileage out of every pound that we spend than other economies do. These are, at least in economic terms, relatively simple things. And from the way they've been making the right noises, you can guess that they seem to have some idea of it. Just never, they just get easily distracted with it. It never seems to actually happen.
One of the things that they do seem completely committed to, which they, in their minds, is going to be a boon to growth, but I don't think anybody really thinks that it will, is their approach to employment rights and sort of the labour market more broadly. So in those NISA numbers that you referenced earlier, Kristian, they also pointed out that the government policy, when you combine the rise in the national minimum wage, the rise in the employers' national insurance contributions and the Employment Rights Act, that the cost of hiring entry-level workers has risen by 7% in real terms, which means that companies are therefore less likely to hire entry-level people into the market, so there's fewer opportunities for younger people, just fewer jobs going around generally, and that will, in their minds, they think the Employment Rights Act, all these things are boons to growth, but they clearly aren't. We've released a report today on flexible working. In the Employment Rights Act, they have strengthened the right to request flexible working to basically make it very, very difficult for companies to say no if an employee requests flexible working. What do you think will be the impact of that decision, of that law?
Well, I mean, the whole law is a pretty bad one, and there's lots and lots of much more directive, compulsory stuff in this act than flexible working. So I don't think anyone doubts that it's going to have a bad effect on the labour market generally as they bring it in. I think the flexible working bit is another kind of turn of the screw on this, that it is now the burden of proof is effectively devolving on the employer. Every time anybody makes a request, the employer is going to have to document it and prove why, to the satisfaction, if necessary, of a tribunal or outside investigation. Got to remember that this under this new Employment Act, the trade unions already have new rights to kind of crawl over management decisions and have access to them. So I think it's going to be very difficult to refuse flexible working in a lot of cases, particularly obviously office work, where the case is stronger. So I'm sure it's going to make a difference. The question is, what difference does that have on productivity at the firm level? That varies massively by firm. Nobody really knows. So the best thing would be to allow individual firms, individual employers, individual staff members to come to some agreement about these things according to local conditions. But that is not now going to be as easy as it once was, and things are going to get worse.
Because it's a problem, right, that working from home can actually work for a lot of people. You can be more flexible around childcare or other things, or they can just focus better at home or whatever. But it can also not work. There are costs to working from home in a lot of ways. There's lots of evidence that links it to health problems, mental and physical, and some people just aren't as productive at working from home. Some people work from home and do just sit and watch the TV all day. So, Kristian, it's a sort of a high acknowledged problem, isn't it? It's the government. Why does the government think that they know what works best for everybody when actually it's surely up to individual employees and employers?
Well, quite. I mean, this is the sort of thing where I remember this from during lockdown, that a lot of people misjudged their working from home situation, even for their own line of work. So, for example, I always used to say prior to the pandemic that I have no real reason to be here other than the Westminster pop culture. I could be anywhere in the world.
There's a good reason.
And there is a good reason, yes. And that's why I was in most of the time. But also purely for work purposes, makes zero difference. I could be anywhere. And when lockdown started, I initially felt vindicated. I thought, well, if anything, I get more stuff done, and this is actually great. But then over time, I realized actually now it maybe would have been good to be surrounded by colleagues, and some decisions are just, there's the sort of thing where a Zoom call is all well and good if you already have an agenda, if you know exactly you want to talk about A, B, and C, but sometimes things can come up spontaneously. Or there is the effect that there may be rotation, and say you may have a team spirit already amongst the people who are there. But then when new ones come in and you've never seen them in real life, you know that there were several people at the end of lockdown that for me were just faces on a computer screen. I'd never seen them in real life. And there it's a bit harder to build up the same kind of relation. And it's that sort of things that you don't necessarily anticipate. I've also seen some people have told me the reverse, that they used to say prior to lockdown, there is no way I could work from home. I need to be at the office physically all the time. I need to be in constant contact with people around me. I don't have the technology. And then suddenly, when they did have to work from home, it turned out that they could actually. So people misjudged this, even talking about their own work, and something which they presumably know more about than anyone in the world. If you can misjudge this regarding your own work, what are the odds really that somebody can make the correct decision for an economy as a whole, or for even for a sector or a region, or whatever, any kind of aggregation? And that's the problem here. Each case is different, and it's just an area where we need a trial and error process, a discovery process, like for so many other things in economic life. And I'd say more than the specific cost that this legislation may have, I think it reveals something about the political mindset of our time. That every time there's some social development, every time there's some change in work practices, or some other development, there needs to be a policy. And we need to come up with a way of standardizing it, of making a decision for the country as a whole. Is this good? Is this bad? Under what circumstances? Why not just let things happen? So my theory is actually that what the pandemic really did, I think the paper mentions that there was a bit of a trend towards working from home even before the pandemic. So in some sectors, some people were doing this, and it was a thing, just not on a massive scale. But it predates the pandemic. What the pandemic did was, firstly, it accelerated it, sure, but it also made it a topic of national conversation. Right. So previously it was happening. Some people were working from home, but I don't remember anyone ever talking about it. It wasn't something that you mentioned. And once it was part of the national conversation, that's when you had demands for legislation. Yeah. And I think in the same way, sometimes you could also say it's a trend in workplaces that some workplaces have espresso machines. If for some reason that became part of the conversation, that we talk about it, there would be some politician saying we now need an espresso rights bill. We need to give people the right to request espresso machines in their workplace, and then there needs to be a policy, and we need to define precisely which companies can opt out and which can't, and so forth. So every time something is a thing that people talk about, there needs to be a policy.
But the reason they've jumped on it so quickly, the government, and so passionately, is because they don't actually bear that much of the cost. Because it's not, we're not arguing about, we need to give 5 billion quid to a certain cause. The government's like, whoa, that's not for us to say. But they can say, actually, no, we do need to sort of mandate the ability to work from home because it doesn't cost us anything, but we can be very popular with voters, unions, whoever, because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a general problem, really, since the Blair government, I think, to at least purport to hold spending down and achieve aims by regulation and control. And we've seen a lot of that. And, as a result, some sectors have become sort of semi-state control because they're so tied in by state regulations that they don't have the normal ability to kind of experiment and choose kind of how they do things. And this doesn't show up in the figures, I think, except in the overall growth and productivity figures, where they most certainly are showing up nowadays. I think the flexible working question specifically, it's obvious to me there's a trade-off here. It varies from firm to firm and person to person, but it's obvious that, in some cases it could be better to spend a day or two at home working, dealing with stuff that would, in your personal life, doctor's appointments, whatever, that would otherwise get in the way of a whole day's work. I can see why that might be, travel time, all that sort of thing. It's just you certainly can't know that from on high. You can only be told by individuals. It's dropped into our report, actually, but not much commented on in it, that there's some evidence that coming in 3 days and being at home for 2, which is emerging as a bit of a practice, doesn't seem to have any kind of aggregate productivity issues. It might even be slightly good for it. At least that's what some of the recent evidence is saying. And I kind of find that intuitively possible, So I don't think it's about being Luddite about this. Yeah, it's just about people need to decide for themselves in agreement with their bosses as to what works.
Yeah, and I could imagine, say, in a proper free market economy, what you might see is that different kinds of employment contracts would be available, where an employer might say, look, here's option 1, office every day, 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock. No deviation from that unless you have prior approval, and here's the salary. Option 2, lots of flexibility, come in whenever you like, or don't come in at all. You may never come in. You have all the choices are yours, but the baseline salary is then going to be a bit lower, so that there's a bit of a negative premium. If they think there's a cost to them from an arrangement like that, they could price that in. It's just that if that happened in our economy, I'm sure you would have people signing up for the flexible contract and then saying, "Oh, we're being discriminated against,
yeah.
and we're doing just as much work as the other guys, and look, this is unfair."
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware in the civil service that civil servants who got a London waiting continued to get it through the pandemic and for years afterwards, even though they never came into London and didn't live in London. So, that's a clear case of how difficult these things are.
And then effectively it will relatively reduce the wages of jobs that you can't do from home, because you can't sort of, if it's surgeons or bus drivers or whatever, if the wages of jobs where you can work remotely don't sort of change to reflect the savings that you make in commuting in or whatever, then those become higher paying jobs, relatively speaking, and therefore more appealing.
Yes.
You won't be a construction worker on Zoom.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's also worth saying, perhaps, that the judgments that people make about whether flexible working is cost effective or not are operating in an environment where the prices are already massively distorted by government decision making. I mean, obviously one of the problems in southern England is that houses are too expensive, so people live further and further away. You then get into subsidising train fares somewhat, not as much as in other countries, but it still exists. So the framework in which people are taking decisions is already massively distorted by government decision making. Who knows what decisions they would reach if the market was allowed to operate better in other cases. So I see, you can see flexible working as a bit of a response to this persistent market failure, as well as something that might be good in itself.
And the other interesting dynamic about this, coming back to the sort of the demands that people make as things become ideas in the national conversation, is that Len and Annabella pointed out in their paper that this isn't the only ask. The unions and the people who want to work from home aren't going to say, okay, great, thanks for giving us that right, we're done now. The next things are 4-day weeks, or the right to disconnect, which I think they have in France. But then you think about what are the impact of these things mounting on top of each other? If you say, okay, well, everybody has the right to work the right to request flexible working, which is basically the default now because businesses can't reject it very easily. And then you put on top of that, well, everybody has the right to not be contacted by their boss after 6 o'clock. Well, how does that work with flexible working? How does that work if you're saying, I want to be able to work, really early in the morning and really late at night, but you can't contact me after 6 o'clock? And these things just add to all the other things you've said, mounting on top of each other, sort of random government regulations that just further complicate the situation and depress the labour market. And then we're back to the growth problem that we discussed at the start. Yeah. Now, just to move on to our third topic, as referenced briefly earlier, the government is stepping up its negotiations with the EU in its Brexit reset deal. Nick Thomas-Symonds has been out apostasising about it in the Financial Times this week. They're looking to unveil a deal on food standards, youth mobility and energy cooperation, among other things. David, you're the man to ask about this. What's your take on the direction that they're going in at the moment?
Well, I mean, at the political level, I think it's clear they would like to get closer to the EU again in some sense. They've chosen a few areas where they wanted to push this. I think they're being a bit dishonest about what's implied, and they're trying to make out that the proposals on food or on electricity or whatever are just another trade deal, whereas in fact they're rejoining the single market in these areas and being part of the EU legal regime without having any say in it. That's the price for removing so-called friction at the border. And I think the Labour Party is clear, would like to go closer, and this is the route they've chosen, a little bit by stealth. they're obviously justifying it in terms of economic growth. I'm really not persuaded by this, I must say. I mean, the food standards thing, SPS rules, which is the big one, or at least the one they've sold it on so far, that says that it will add 9 billion to the economy by 2035 or 40. I forget the exact date. It's a long way out. Anyway, which is basically zero. It's so close to zero as to be zero, I think. The bigger problem behind this is that most European countries, not all, but most, are suffering from a version of the same problems that we are. In some areas, their problems are worse. In some areas, they're not quite as bad, but they've all got some version of the European malaise. And I don't know why, kind of reducing barriers is in itself going to help. I do think that once you've decided to leave the EU and separate out the legal systems as we did, the only rational thing to do is to do things differently as far as you can and mark out some competitive difference. And obviously for me and for us, that means a somewhat more neoliberal economy, if you like, than the one in the EU. But we haven't done that. We've left and we're still carrying on the European model. So why would you expect things to be better?
It's about the trade-offs, isn't it? So I think we would largely agree that reducing barriers to trade is a good thing.
Yeah.
But if that means that you could reduce fewer barriers elsewhere, the perfect example is the customs union, then the sort of the benefits don't necessarily outweigh the negatives. Kristian, what's your view on it?
Well, I think this shows that a lot of politicians are still in a 2016 mindset where they try to constantly refight the referendum from back then. So this idea of single market alignment or membership even, there was a justification for it in 2016 to 2021 when the argument was that this is the position that we're starting from anyway, so it's the minimally disruptive option. And also the argument was that, well, having the option of regulatory divergence, that in itself carries a cost because it means that from the perspective of the EU, you are now a third party. Even if you don't actually change anything, even if you maintain all the same rules and regulations, from their perspective, just the fact that you could deviate tomorrow means you are now a third party, and that means there are some additional regulatory trade barriers. So the argument for staying close to or in the single market was that, well, the fact that these frictions exist, that's not a reason for never considering the option of leaving the single market or doing things differently. It just means it comes at a cost, and if you do it, make sure that you do it for a reason. You should then have a list of things that you want to do and that you couldn't do inside of the single market. Otherwise, you get the worst of both worlds. You're outside of it. You incur the cost of being outside of the single market, and you're not making use of any of the additional options that there gives you. So that's why in those 5 years, 2016 to 2021, I also wrote repeatedly that actually I think we should stay in the single market because I just don't trust any British government to do much on the regulatory side. I think we would just incur the cost and then not do anything with it. However, that was the debate then. Now we have left and we are in a different position. That's what I mean by 2016 mindset. I think nowadays it shouldn't matter so much anymore what you said from 2016 to 2021. I think even if from the perspective of a very pro-EU Europhile government, they should still say, well, we are now in a different starting position. Now, realigning ourselves to the single market, that is the option that takes some effort, takes some political capital. Why shouldn't even a very Europhile government now say, well, we are outside now? Isn't there something on the regulatory side that we could do that would benefit the economy with the additional options that we now have, the additional flexibility that we now have? Because I think before Brexit became this massive culture war issue, I don't think there was anyone in the country, not even say Nick Clegg or James O'Brien, who would have said that every single EU regulation is absolutely perfect for the British economy and that there's nothing that could be improved upon. What they would have said is that, well, as a package, it makes sense, even if many individual things don't. As a package, it makes sense because it means that we have frictionless trade with our neighbors, and okay, all well and good. But surely even Nick Clegg would have been able to identify some rules that he would rather not have had. So why not go back to those now and say, well, now we're outside of it, let's change those now.
How vindicated do you feel for what you wrote before we left the single market in saying that you didn't trust anybody to diverge enough if we did leave?
Well, I mean, that is the situation that we now have, and that's the reason why, I've said this on one of the previous episodes, that's the reason why this comes up again and again. It's because we are still in such similar places that realignment wouldn't be that hard to do. If we had a situation where, say, in several key sectors, we had a regulatory regime that was totally different from the one in the EU, then it would be too much hassle to talk about single market realignment. And then even a James O'Brien-led government wouldn't do it because they would say, well, this is so much hassle, I'm not going to do it. And that's why they're not really talking about joining the customs union anymore, because that's where there has been.
We have trade, we have trade deals. Yeah. Where it's not completely the same, was it? We have diverged in some places.
Yeah, we've done a bit, and of course the EU has itself diverged in some areas where we've not been in it, and that's also part of it. We have done some very tentative financial services reforms, for example. We have done some food agriculture reforms. We have changed our support system for agriculture quite a lot compared to the EU norm, for example. But it's all been a little bit kind of tentative. And, in my view, what we've done, I've always said there is a small cost from leaving single market and customs union. I mean, you can argue about it, say it's 1%, something like that. I reckon we've done enough reforms to kind of more or less compensate for that. And that's why you don't really see any change to the growth pattern through Brexit, because nothing very significant has happened yet. I think the thing that gets forgotten about, being part of the single market in these areas is the lack of ability to influence the laws. I think in a lot of people's heads, it's still like we're joining and we get some say, and we're not. We're joining and we don't get any say. We may get the right to kind of express a view, but having been on the other side of these things, I know how seriously that's taken. And on food and agriculture, for example, when we were an EU member, we were constantly running up against, regulatory measures that didn't suit our particular sector, whether it was farm support, whether it was like the British sausage or British chocolate or all these sort of things. We were constantly running up against this and endlessly having to lobby. In fact, the very last thing I did in number 10 on the night we left the EU was try and persuade the rest of the EU, because we were still going into the transition period and therefore still bound by the laws, to agree some change to regulations for game birds and how they were shot and how they could be sold. And I remember sending off this email to all my EU colleagues saying it's something like, it seems all too symbolic that on the night we're leaving, I'm still arguing about food regulation up to the very last moment. And I think this gets forgotten. We'll be in a system, we have no control over it, and you'll soon find, in fact, we're already finding people complaining about, I can't use this pesticide, I can't investigate GMs or gene editing in the way I hoped. We're bound to, and everybody forgets that negative the problem side.
You can see exactly where that ends up, though, can't you? In 6 months, 12 months, 18 months' time, there'll be people arguing, well, we need to get ourselves a seat at the table, and suddenly the pendulum in the argument starts swinging the other way, and we're just repeating the 2016 arguments about being in and not having a say or whatever.
Yeah, we really are. And I mean, it is quite depressing that after 10 years of debate, so few people still seem to understand kind of what the single market is or what the customs union is and what the trade-offs are, despite having endlessly debated them. It's still out there.
I do think one of the things that gets maybe under-measured or under-talked about at least is the, again, sort of the opportunity cost or the sort of counterfactual of of us having left the EU and what things would have been like if we were still in on the negative side as well. I think the one time that has been brought up is the trade wars last year, that we managed to stay out of the sort of EU's posturing to Trump and the tariffs that they got hit with. But I'm sure there were plenty of other examples where the EU has, as you mentioned earlier, the EU has diverged in a way that we wouldn't have liked to go. So at least we've avoided doing that. So to an extent, even standing still, if the EU is going in the wrong direction, then standing still is not, well, at least something. But the government clearly has its eyes set in a certain direction. Are we hopeful? Do we think there's anything in their idea that whatever they're planning will have some boon to growth, at least? Even if it's the wrong direction and not as good as it could have been otherwise, do you think there'll be any positive numbers to it?
Well, there might be small ones. The problem is just that, say, some of the things that you mentioned, I think even within this government, there are probably some ministers who think that way too, who can point to some examples of current regulations or inherited, retained EU law regulations that they're not particularly happy with. It's just that if they always have an eye on realignment with the single market or the option of maybe even rejoining the EU at some point, if they always have their eye on that, that could in itself constrain them from moving too far away from that, because they may think, well, this may be the right thing to do for now, but this will constrain our future options. This will make any future negotiations with the EU more complicated, and it could well be that holds them back, that they don't want to block that path for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're already seeing some of that actually in the internal debates. In fact, we saw a bit of it under the last government actually, in the whole saga about how do we get rid of EU law. And one of the reasons why we didn't, to the extent that was thought about, was this sort of edginess about getting too far, and actually also complicating the Great Britain, Northern Ireland issue, which is something we probably shouldn't get into now. But
we'll leave that for another
those days, do the constraint.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is all we've got time for. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you too for listening and or watching. Remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss another episode, and subscribe to us at Substack at insider.iea.org.uk too. Thank you very much for joining us. We will see you next time.